Before dawn on June 6, 1944, the Normandy coast lay under a low ceiling of cloud and mist. To German defenders, it was another restless night at the edge of Fortress Europe, a night shaped by false alarms, scattered reports, and the steady belief that the weather itself was an ally. Along the bluffs and concrete batteries overlooking the English Channel, officers scanned the darkness with tired eyes, convinced that any Allied landing would come elsewhere, if it came at all. At the Christ Coastal Battery, a young German artillery officer raised his binoculars towards the sea. As the first grey light crept across the horizon, what he saw did not fit within any framework he had been taught. The water was no longer empty, it was crowded. Shapes multiplied as the light strengthened, silhouettes stacking upon silhouettes until the horizon itself seemed to vanish. Ships were everywhere, layered deep, stretching from one edge of vision to the other. This was not a fleet. It was an armada without precedent. For years, German intelligence had assured its commanders that the Western Allies lacked both the will and the capacity to mount a decisive invasion of France. The Americans, in particular, were dismissed as industrial amateurs, incapable of translating civilian abundance into military precision. An invasion, if attempted, would be limited, manageable. Something the Atlantic Wall had been designed to defeat. What now filled the Channel shattered that belief in an instant. Nearly 7,000 vessels were advancing toward Normandy. Warships, landing craft, transports, and support ships moved in carefully controlled lanes, their engines churning the sea into a broad white scar. They carried not just soldiers but an entire system of war, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, spare parts, and the infrastructure to sustain an army indefinitely once ashore. This was not a gamble, it was a calculation. At 5:52 a.m., orders reached the Christ Battery. The guns were to open fire. Moments later, massive coastal cannons began hurling shells toward the oncoming fleet. The rounds arced high, splashing among the leading warships. For the gunners, there was a brief sense of purpose, even hope. They were fighting back. They were doing what they had trained to do, but the illusion did not last. The Allied fleet absorbed the fire and continued advancing, its formation barely disturbed. Where one ship maneuvered away from a splash, another slid seamlessly into position. The defenders had been trained to think in terms of targets and ammunition stocks. What confronted them was something different entirely, a system built on redundancy, scale, and replaceability. As the coastal batteries fired, Allied warships responded. Heavy guns spoke from the sea, their shells screaming inland with a force that dwarfed anything the defenders had previously experienced. Concrete trembled, observation posts shook. Entire sections of the Atlantic walls disappeared beneath clouds of dust and debris. Farther inland, the night had already delivered its first warning. In the early hours before dawn, reports began flooding into German headquarters. Parachutists were landing across Normandy, not in small raiding parties, but in mass. American airborne divisions were descending behind the beaches, seizing bridges, road junctions, and causeways. To experienced German officers, the meaning was unmistakable. Airborne landings of that scale were not diversions, they were commitments. Someone, somewhere, had decided that the time for half measures was over. Yet confusion reigned. The German command structure was rigid, fragmented, and constrained by political interference. Authority over armored reserves was centralized at the highest levels, requiring approval that could not be obtained quickly. Field commanders knew something enormous was unfolding, but they lacked the freedom to act decisively. As dawn broke fully, the magnitude of the situation became impossible to deny. From bunkers and observation posts along 50 miles of coastline, the same reports poured in. The sea was filled with ships, thousands of them. Not a raid, not a feint. An invasion on a scale no one had imagined possible. At strong points overlooking Omaha Beach, young German infantrymen stared through firing slits and rangefinders, struggling to process what lay before them. Many had never seen the ocean before arriving in Normandy. Now the water itself seemed to have vanished beneath steel. The horizon was gone. At 5:30 a.m., the naval bombardment intensified. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers unleashed a storm of fire against the coastal defenses. Shells weighing more than a ton smashed into bunkers, gun positions and communications lines. In minutes, carefully constructed defensive networks were reduced to isolated pockets of resistance. This was the first lesson of the day, and it was brutal in its clarity. The defenders were not being attacked by an army in the traditional sense, they were being overwhelmed by an industrial system capable of concentrating unimaginable force at a chosen point in time and space. Even so, some positions held. On Omaha Beach, German units manned well-sited bunkers and machine gun nests that overlooked narrow stretches of sand. When the first American infantry landed under fire, the scene turned horrific. Men fell in the surf, landing craft were shredded. For a moment it seemed as though preparation and fortification might still matter. But the moment was fleeting as casualties mounted on the beach. Allied commanders made a decision that would have been unthinkable to most navies of the era. Destroyers were ordered to close the shore. They steamed directly into shallow water, braving mines and artillery to bring their guns to point-blank range. From less than 1,000 yards they fired directly into German strongpoints, one by one, methodically dismantling the defenses. Ships were hit, one destroyer was sunk, others were damaged. Yet, the line did not falter. Where a vessel was lost, another took its place almost immediately. For German observers, this behavior was incomprehensible. Their own navy had been shaped by scarcity. Every ship was precious, irreplaceable. Here, ships were tools. They were used aggressively, even recklessly, because there were more behind them. Many more. By mid-morning, the pattern became unmistakable. Landing craft kept coming. Tanks rolled ashore. Trucks swam out of the water and drove inland under their own power. Supplies appeared not in dribs and drabs, but in torrents. The beachhead did not shrink under pressure. It expanded. Above it all, the sky belonged entirely to the Allies. Thousands of aircraft filled the air, unchallenged. Fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance planes operated in continuous waves, striking targets almost at will. German aircraft appeared only rarely, and when they did, they were quickly driven off. This was not just superiority. It was dominance so complete that resistance became an exercise in futility. By the end of the day, more than 150,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy. They were supported by tens of thousands of vehicles, thousands of tanks, and mountains of supplies. The German forces defending the region possessed a fraction of that strength and no realistic means of stopping what had begun. As night fell on June 6, 1944, German officers up and down the Normandy front confronted a realization that went beyond tactics or courage. They were not losing because they fought poorly. They were losing because the war itself had changed. What had crossed the Channel that morning was not merely an invasion force. It was the visible expression of an industrial civilization at war, capable of generating and sustaining combat power on a scale that made traditional measures of strength obsolete. For those who watched the endless ships arrive, the truth was unmistakable. The outcome was no longer a matter of strategy. It was arithmetic. As June 6th gave way to June 7th, the German command structure began to fracture under the weight of what it was witnessing. Reports from the coast grew more alarming by the hour, yet Berlin remained trapped inside its own assumptions. The invasion, many insisted, could not be the main effort. It was too obvious, too exposed. Somewhere else, at some later moment, the real blow would fall. This belief was not accidental. It had been carefully engineered. For months, Allied deception planners had constructed an elaborate illusion known as Operation Fortitude. Phantom armies appeared on German aerial photographs. Dummy tanks and aircraft filled fields in southeast England. Radio traffic suggested the existence of massive formations that did not exist. At the center of this deception stood a single figure whose reputation loomed large in German minds: George Patton. To German intelligence, Patton embodied American aggressiveness. Where Patton went, they believed, the main effort would follow. Even as Normandy burned, German high command clung to the conviction that the landings were a feint. Reserves were held back. Armored divisions waited for orders that never came. Time, the most precious commodity in war, slipped away. On the ground, German units attempted to react, but the environment itself had turned hostile. Allied air supremacy transformed every road into a killing zone. Columns moving by daylight were spotted and destroyed within minutes. Even at night, movement was perilous. Bridges were smashed, rail lines severed, and command posts buried under bombardment. The famous German armored formations that had once redefined warfare found themselves paralyzed. Tanks could not reach the front in strength. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition stocks dwindled rapidly. Communications broke down under constant attack. When armored counterattacks did occur, they collided with a new reality. Naval gunfire reached miles inland, directed by spotters who could summon battleship shells with frightening accuracy. No tank armor could withstand a direct hit from a naval gun. Entire formations were shattered before they could even deploy. German officers who had survived the Eastern Front, who had faced Soviet mass and brutality, now confronted something different. This was not attrition through sacrifice. It was annihilation through efficiency. Behind the beaches, the Allies demonstrated another capability the Germans had never seriously anticipated: the ability to build infrastructure faster than it could be destroyed. Within days of the landings, massive artificial harbors began taking shape off the Normandy coast. Prefabricated in Britain, towed across the Channel, and assembled under fire, these structures turned open water into functioning ports. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to deny the Allies access to French harbors. The Allies responded by making harbors irrelevant. Concrete caissons were sunk to form breakwaters. Floating roadways stretched from ships to shore. Entire supply chains materialized almost overnight. Even when storms damaged parts of the system, repairs were swift. The flow of men and material did not stop. German aerial reconnaissance photographed the growing installations and delivered the images to headquarters. Many officers initially refused to believe what they were seeing. Harbors did not appear in days. They took years. And yet, here they were. As June turned into July, the consequences of the first day compounded relentlessly. Allied forces expanded their lodgment, grinding forward through hedgerows and villages. Every engagement favored the side with more artillery, more ammunition, more vehicles, and more replacements. The Germans fought skillfully, often desperately, but they were being consumed faster than they could adapt. The psychological toll was immense. German officers who had been raised on doctrines of superiority and inevitability confronted evidence that their worldview was fundamentally flawed. They were not facing decadent opponents. They were facing societies that had mobilized science, industry, and logistics as weapons. In Normandy, war became an equation with known variables and a predetermined outcome. When the Allies launched their breakout offensive later that summer, the final lesson was delivered with devastating clarity. Massive bombing attacks erased entire defensive zones. Armored spearheads surged through gaps that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. German divisions dissolved, not through defeat in battle alone, but through systemic collapse. By August, the remnants of German forces were trapped in a shrinking pocket, surrounded by air power, artillery, and armor. Vehicles were abandoned by the thousands. Heavy weapons were destroyed by their own crews for lack of fuel or ammunition. What escaped did so as fragments, no longer capable of coherent resistance. After the campaign, German generals searched for explanations. Some blamed Hitler, some blamed intelligence failures, some blamed luck. But among those who had witnessed Normandy firsthand, a deeper understanding emerged. They had not been outmaneuvered. Factories had defeated fortifications, supply chains had crushed strategy. The war they had prepared to fight no longer existed. Years later, veterans from both sides returned to the Normandy coast. The concrete bunkers still stood in places scarred and broken. The beaches were quiet. The sea, once filled with ships, rolled gently against the sand. For the German officers who had looked out over the Channel on that morning in June, the memory never faded. They had seen the future arrive at 8 knots, stretching from horizon to horizon, and they had understood, with terrible clarity, that no amount of courage could stop it. In the weeks that followed the collapse of the Normandy front, the surviving German leadership was forced into an uncomfortable reckoning. The campaign had exposed a truth that many had sensed, but few had dared to articulate while the war still raged. Germany had entered a form of warfare it could no longer survive. The German army had been built on operational brilliance, discipline, and speed. It excelled when wars were decided by maneuver and shock. But Normandy revealed that maneuver meant little when every movement could be detected, targeted, and destroyed by forces that seemed to exist in limitless quantity. The battlefield had become transparent. Every road, field, and village was subject to observation from the air. Every concentration of men or machines invited destruction. For German commanders, this transparency was suffocating. Planning cycles collapsed. Orders were outdated before they reached the front. Units operated blind, cut off from higher headquarters, reacting rather than directing. Even experienced officers found themselves commanding fragments rather than formations. The Allied system functioned differently. Communications flowed continuously. Forward observers directed fire from ships miles offshore. Fighter bombers loitered overhead, waiting to be called in like artillery. Logistics did not merely support operations, they defined what operations were possible. Losses were absorbed without disrupting momentum. Equipment appeared where it was needed, when it was needed. German officers struggled to articulate this imbalance in their reports. Traditional language failed them. How do you describe an enemy whose strength does not diminish when you inflict losses? How do you counter a force that replaces destroyed tanks faster than you can count them? After the war, many attempted to answer those questions. Some framed Normandy as a tragedy of missed opportunity. If only the reserves had been released sooner. If only the weather had been worse. If only deception had been seen through in time. These explanations offered comfort, but they did not address the underlying reality. Even had every German division been committed on June 6th, even had the beaches been held for days or weeks longer, the outcome would not have changed. The Allied capacity to generate combat power dwarfed anything Germany could hope to match. The imbalance was structural, not situational. By 1944, the United States alone was producing aircraft, vehicles, and ammunition at rates that exceeded the combined output of its enemies. This production was not theoretical, it was visible on the battlefield. Every destroyed plane was replaced, every sunken ship was substituted. Every fallen soldier was followed by another trained, equipped, and transported across an ocean. German industry, battered by years of bombing and constrained by limited resources, could not compete. The effort to do so strained the nation beyond endurance. Skilled workers were scarce. Fuel was rationed to desperation. Transportation networks collapsed under Allied air attack. Even the most advanced weapons projects could not compensate for shortages measured in millions of tons. For those who had watched the Allied armada approach Normandy, this reality had announced itself immediately. The sea of ships was not just a military formation, it was a balance sheet made visible. Years later, German veterans would speak of that morning with a mixture of awe and resignation. They recalled the silence before dawn, the first outlines of ships emerging from the mist, the moment when counting became meaningless. The memory carried less bitterness than clarity. In that instant, they had understood something fundamental about modern war. Courage still mattered. Skill still mattered. Leadership still mattered. But none of these could overcome an opponent who possessed overwhelming material superiority and the organizational capacity to apply it coherently. The war in Normandy did not merely defeat the German army, it dismantled an entire way of thinking about conflict. It marked the transition from wars decided by generals to wars decided by factories, logistics, and economic systems. This lesson did not end in 1944. It shaped the post-war world. Many of the German officers who survived went on to play roles in a new Europe, one defined less by conquest than by integration. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that isolated nations could not compete in an age of industrialized warfare. Cooperation was no longer an ideal, it was a necessity. Standing decades later on the cliffs and beaches of Normandy, veterans confronted the quiet aftermath of a moment that had reshaped history. The guns were gone, the ships were gone, but the implications remained. On June 6, 1944, the German defenders of the Atlantic Wall had prepared to repel an invasion. Instead, they encountered the full expression of an industrial civilization at war. They faced not merely soldiers, but systems, not merely weapons, but production lines. Their defeat was not sudden, and it was not instantaneous, but it was inevitable from the moment the horizon filled with ships. The future had arrived on the tide, and it had rendered the past obsolete.